Good evening. My name is Pauline Leven. I'm a professor in the classics department and co-organizer of the Parry lecture along with my wonderful colleague from comparative literature, Ayesha Ramachandran. It's an honor and delight to welcome you all to the 11th annual Amory and Adam Parry lecture. A few words before I introduce tonight's guests. First, I'm very grateful to Linda Dickey-Saucier for working on all the logistics of tonight, including the reception to which you're all invited, which is situated here. So it's after the talk. Usually this lecture is held in the spring, and I have a weather advisory note tonight. We don't need it, but it's also an unusual lecture in that it's the second of the year, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. But I'm going to give the usual note. This event is being recorded, so if you could please make sure all cell phones and electronic devices are turned off, that would make for an even nicer recording for posterity. Second, I need to say a little bit about the series to which tonight's lecture belongs. The Parry Lecture Initiative started 10 years ago and aims to highlight the work of scholars of ancient literature and culture who excel in the methods and talents that were once so beautifully exemplified by Amory and Adam Parry, whose picture is hanging over there. The thoughtful and detailed analysis of Greek and Latin texts, as well as the further reception of those texts in ways that are at once adventurous, elegantly written, and critically informed. The Bingham Library is the right place for this lecture. It houses the books that once belonged to Amory and Adam Parry, as well as the PhD dissertations of just some of the many students whom the dynamic husband and wife pair would have worked with in the late 60s and early 70s before meeting their tragic simultaneous end in a motorcycle accident in 1971. Both Anne and Adam were leading scholars of Homer and Homeric criticism, as well as the study of other ancient texts, especially Thucydides and Virgil. It is in the spirit of their wide-ranging and exciting scholarship that we invited for the inaugural lecture Joseph Rousseau, a proud former colleague and protege of both Amory and Adam Parry. And it is with equal commitment to that spirit that we welcomed 2 years ago the poet and translator A.E. Stallings, now professor of poetry at Oxford, and last year Joe Quinn, professor of history at Oxford, who took us through the colonial mythscapes of African Dido, if you remember. Today, the Parry Lecture is looking a little different from the previous 10 that we've hosted. We are honored to have not just one, but two guests of honor. And they will not so much lecture as enter in conversation that will be led by my co-conspirator, Ayesha. Because all of us share in the belief that form matters, I'll introduce them in reverse alphabetical order and from the most local to Yale to the person who has traveled the furthest. So Ayesha Ramachandran is professor of comparative literature here at Yale. She's a scholar of the literatures and cultures of early modern Europe. Mostly working in English, French, and Italian literary traditions, she explores the disciplinary, theoretical, and material challenges posed by globalization from the late 15th century to the present. Her writing focuses on the making of worlds through interdisciplinary relations between art and science, particularly poetry, philosophy, natural and political, cartography, visual, and print culture. She is the author of The World Makers, Global Imagining in Early Modern Europe, University of Chicago Press, 2015, and of the forthcoming Lyric Thinking Towards a Global Poetics. She will moderate the conversation. Professor Tom Phillips is partly a local. He is currently visiting associate professor in the humanities program here at Yale, but he usually teaches at the University of Manchester in the UK. Professor Phillips is a specialist of Greek poetry and music and their ancient and modern receptions. His first book, Pindar's Library, Performance Poetry and Material Texts, OUP 2016, dealt with the scholarly and literary reception of Pindar. His second monograph, Untimely Epic, Apollonius Rhodius Argonautica 2020, was concerned with the configuration of temporal experience in Apollonius of Rhodes' epic. Several of the collected volumes he has published, including Music, Text and Culture in Ancient Greece, 2018, and also from 2018, Textual Events, Performance and the Lyric in Early Greece, examined the relationship between music and literature. His interest in ancient literary scholarship and criticism has also led him to develop a long-term collaborative project to translate the remains of ancient commentaries to the Iliad, the Scholia, and to explore their role in Greek cultural life from the 3rd century BCE to the 3rd century CE. His current work focuses on the Hellenism of the Romantic poet Shelley and on eco-critical approaches to Greek poetry. I'll add that this is his 3rd Yale event in 2 weeks, so I hope we are appropriately stimulating him rather than exploiting or exhausting him. Finally, Professor Joe Moshenska is a professor of English literature at Oxford and a specialist of the literature and culture of the 16th and 17th century. In his own words, he's tended to work at the intersection between literature and contiguous fields, philosophy, theology, science, visual arts, and he has long-standing interests in critical theory, including currently the implications for literature of recent work in anthropology and the overlaps between critical and creative practice. He is the author of 4 books: Feeling Pleasures, The Sense of Touch in Renaissance England, 2014, a book aimed at the general reader, A Stained in the Blood, The Remarkable Voyage of Sir Kenelm Digby, Iconoclasm as Child's Play, 2019, and an experimental biography of Milton, Making Darkness Light, which came out in paperback in 2022. He's currently working on a monograph that focuses on Spinoza, and most specifically on the strangeness of Spinoza. At the center of this book sits the question, why has Spinoza, who is perhaps the least obviously literary of the great philosophers, his dense and abstract prose aspiring to the status of geometry, why has Spinoza been so admired and beloved by a long series of great imaginative writers? Tonight, the 3 of them will be in conversation on the topic of muses and models, Virgil, Spinoza, and critical theory. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming them.
Just to give you a quick sense of how this event is going to unfold, this unusual Parry lecture format. So Tom Phillips will first speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, followed by Joe Moshenska. Then they will ask each other questions because they have not been able to stop talking to each other for the last, I don't know how long, and have continued to chit-chat. So I allowed them to talk to each other rather than pepper them with questions myself. Then I will probably ask them 1 or 2 questions, and we will open it up to all of you for questions. So the goal of this is to be a kind of experimental Parry lecture in the spirit of new work that both of them are doing. And so I am excited for the conversation, as I hope you will be. Tom.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much to Professor Leven and Professor Ramachandran for the invitation to speak here this evening. It's a great honor and a great pleasure and delight to be with you here this evening. So, if we were asked to nominate a poem from antiquity that could help us think about what we experience when we inhabit an earth imperiled by climate catastrophe and extractivist exploitation, Virgil's 4th Eclogue might seem an odd or even perverse choice. A poem that apparently embodies an anthropocentric view of the cosmos by envisaging a coming age that will be ideal for humans. It also reads easily as an escapist fantasy about nature, in which gods bestow blessings and, of course, sheep entertain us by changing colour. Much of the poem's reception history would seem to confirm that view. When Dante writes in 1311 to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VII to say that when the emperor last visited Italy, quote, many people began to sing with Maro that both Saturn's reign and the Virgin were returning, he, like many medieval and Renaissance authors, employs the eclogue's language to address social and political affairs. And yet I want to explore the idea that this poem has its strange and even disturbing elements, and that these might be helpful for us in thinking about how we conceive ourselves as readers of Virgil today, and perhaps as classicists more broadly. If my reading does not quite seek, in the manner of Adam Parry's classic article, to bring out the two voices of Eclogue 4, it does argue that the poem elaborates, at least on occasions, a more ambiguous, fraught imagining of the earth than critical discussions have tended, I think, to find in it. In order to attend to such imagining, to consider its possible ramifications, and to think reflexively about the forms which comparative juxtapositions of ancient and modern texts might take, I read the poem, or rather one passage from it, alongside an essay on landscape by Jean-Luc Nancy. As I shall elaborate further when returning to the theme and language of models in my conclusion, the relation between these texts that I explore, I think, is one of open, non-hierarchical interaction rather than one of direct hermeneutic applicability. So I don't see Nancy as giving us, as it were, the key to reading Eclogue 4. And the reason I think that is that Nancy's thinking can help us disclose or be attentive to features of Eclogue 4 that, in fact, he would deny to ancient texts. So, to start with Nancy. At the heart of Nancy's essay, and I'm obviously going to treat this quite kind of reductively here, is a simple argument. In pagan antiquity, what we call landscape, paysage, Nancy says, did not exist. Instead, ancient poetry and painting gives us settings, décors, that derive their meanings from the actions, human or divine, that take place in them. They're resolutely anthropocentric. They're also places of plenitude. The pagan or peasant can encounter the divine anywhere, because that world is filled with gods. In the early modern period, Nancy's not quite precise about when this happens, but it's presumably the sort of 17th century, a little bit before, a shift takes place. Landscape, paysage, emerges when, as Nancy puts it, Christianity drives the pagan gods out of nature, quoting from Chateaubriand there, with the result that what is present is immensity itself in landscape. And that's structured around a withdrawal of presence. And on the face of it, Eclogue 4 would seem to fit readily into this model of intellectual history. It, of course, hails the return of Saturn's kingdom, as we've already seen in that quotation from Dante. It evokes Lucina's blessing on its famously mysterious child, and it pictures that child among heroes and gods. Its superabundant futures, in which oaks sweat with honey and fleeces of sheep change colour, appears to manifest divine concern for human life. But responding to long-standing debate about the poem's tone and register, I want to suggest that these snapshots of the future can disturb as well as console or exhilarate, and they can produce experiences akin to those which Nancy sees as characteristic of paysage. So more specifically, I want to suggest that the limitless opening onto a taking place of the unknown, as Nancy puts it in his typically kind of prophetic manner, onto an asignificational absenting of meaningful acknowledgeable presences, which Nancy finds in modern landscapes, helpfully adumbrates the structuring of vegetal and animal life, particularly vegetal life, as impossible superabundance in Eclogue 4. So I want to suggest that this formulation of Nancy's, le paysage ouvre sur l'inconnu, can help us address this passage from Eclogue 4. So despite tibi puer tibi, these lines do not order space for a specifically situated viewer, as in Maurice Merleau-Ponty's celebrated account of landscape painting. Indeed, they do something like the opposite, as the address to the child who cannot yet take in the scene described indicates. The imaginative gaze of the reader here is diverted into a melee of unstructured seeing. We're invited to trace the intractable, ageometric spiraling of errantis hederas, and to lose ourselves in an everywhere passing that confounds spatial and temporal situation. How far does it extend? How is it perceived? And for how long? Stylistic texture accentuates this divagatory undoing of our attentional resources by achieving a partition of voice that is discordant with the world being envisaged. The balanced anaphora of occidet, the coordination of ipsa, the cunabula as a kind of cornucopia neatly sealed in a hexameter in which word order transforms the willful vitality of fundet into a keystone around which the line balances. Each of these movements of configuration separate expression from referent. Even the enjambment of ubera, with its implication of fecundity overspilling normative divisions, is less an assuredly mimetic equation of style and event, I would say, than a moment at which non-identity between regimes of sense becomes legible, at which the coordinating modality of verse, figure, diction, rhythm is shown unequal to sense in Nancy's specific understanding of that term, as that dimension of our worldedness with which we are always primordially co-implicated. These lines, in other words, display a hypertrophy of surfaces that fissure the readerly encounter into a sensing of the traces left in verbal texture by the exorbitant event of, to use Nancy's language again, a taking place of sense. What occurs in the ateleological action of fundet as vegetal growth is approximated to the uncontainable expanding of water, is the positioning of the reader against or alongside a limitless opening. And yet, this is not the localization or locality of sense that Nancy diagnoses as at work in landscape's representation of the land. What we find in Eclogue 4, or at least in these lines, is not what Nancy calls a delimited angle in which landscape emerges, but something more like a delocalized infinity of vegetal surfaces, or at least an ungraspable plenitude. Nancy's description of landscape's constitutive view as, quote, a springing up or a surging forth, the opening and presentation of a sense that refers to nothing but this presentation, glosses a process akin to what I think we can find in Virgil's lines, in which the sheer manifestation of growth predominates over the uses to which those growing things might be put. Imagine the labour required to cultivate all that balsam, economically useful though balsam was, and induces a wondering spectatorship in which we might find ourselves lost were we not to cling to the ordering conceit of the poem's fiction and its stylistic spacing. What occurs in Virgil's vision is not the evacuation that structures Nancy's paysage. Rather, these lines, if we allow ourselves to be drawn into their conceit, stage a plenitude of apparent surfaces so extended as to defeat reckoning, such that these plants effectively absent themselves, not only into the regime of a fiction, the spiralling of the poem's impossible imagined scenario, but also because we cannot imagine what it would be like to be the scene of their presence. So what wider interpretative stances or tendencies might we draw from this experience of perturbation, if that's what we allow ourselves to find in these lines, reading with Nancy? The tonal atmosphere of the passage can be read as established by munuscula, those little gifts, which in the light of Nancy's reflections we could understand as a constitutive miss or under-reading of the gift-like givenness of sense as a miraculous, all-pervasive openness in which any of our relations to the world might be grounded. Conceiving the gift of the earth as directed towards human pleasures, we might think, evinces a narrowing of recognition, a failure to establish a language adequate to the sense which the imagined future scenario appears to open up. But if munuscula, these little gifts, suggests anthropocentrism, it's also a qualification from which relation to the earth might be rethought. In statements such as Assyrium hamomum, that Assyrian spice springing up on every soil, an apparently domineering declarativeness, right, the prophetic poet's confident prediction, a boldly assertive parsing of reality by a subject that stands aside from it and predicts it and to a certain extent masters it, is countermanded by the manner in which the passage's evocations of what Nancy calls a taking place of sense urge on us an attention that is ateleological, in that it cannot fully grasp these processes of vegetal growth that are being talked about. and yet also productive in that it allows us to imagine this fictional domain. The diminutive minuscula gives point to this paradox by reducing the Earth's miraculous bestowal to the slivers of apprehension through which we are constrained to grasp it. What this term invites, on my reading, is a type of listening which, to use Nancy's language, strains towards a possible meaning without finalising it. Juxtaposing this expropriative tending towards an outside with other modes of thinking, narrative, political allegory, literary history, and so on, the poem enables a disposition towards this kind of divagatory listening to be carried forward into these other tendencies to thought, to interrupt, and to inform them. So on this reading, these lines proffer a vision that might perturb, wrench our perceptions, and alienate us from the future they imagine. They surprise us into new understandings of phenomena, which might be little gifts and overwhelming, disruptive abundance simultaneously. And they give us perhaps a new way of thinking about poetry itself. Read against the vision of the future which follows them, they call attention to the poem's articulation of multiple, perhaps discontinuous or conflicting ways of imagining and relating to the earth. So obviously a lot more might be said on the basis of this sketch. We might begin from the obvious point that the environmental circumstances prophesied in Eclogue 4 have not come to pass. We might start to consider the social, political, and historical consequences of the intimation that human fantasies of abundance turn out to entail the precipitation of the human subject into a domain of exorbitant self-presentation in which that subject is overturned or undone, or at least reoriented. But I want to end with some further brief reflections on reading as a site in which relations to the world emerge. And multiplicity, I think, is the key point that I want to emphasize here. Nancy ostensibly provides, in a manner, in some respects, similar to Spinoza, as Professor Moshenska is about to discuss, a kind of static model for reading Virgil and situating him in European intellectual history, insofar as he creates a conceptual framework on which the understanding of Virgil's poem is to be based and to which that text should correspond. Virgil also models Nancy's thesis, insofar as his is a corpus from which Nancy draws inductive inferences in order to construct his theory. But in common with what Professor Moshenska was going to say about Spinoza, I've approached Nancy more here as a kind of dynamic model for reading, insofar as the gaps in his scheme and the indirectness with which his conceptions apply to Virgil's writing have been what I found most fruitful. And there's more to be said here about the dynamism of Nancy's own writing, its marriage of form and argument. But as the quotation from which Dante, with which I began, exemplifies, later writers have often found in Eclogue 4 a template which defines what panegyric and related political speech should consist of. But by reading with Nancy, I've also tried to show that Virgil's text can be a model in other, more oblique ways. At the small scale, we can recognise this process by taking Virgil's minuscula as a kind of modulus, a formal inflection in which a potentially estranging experience begins to resonate. If Eclogue 4 opens up a future that's always on the cusp of disappearing into its own fictionality, its articulation of form and phenomena also has the potential to leave traces of that domain in us, in our ways of perceiving, attending, and thinking, and thereby model relations to reality, which we might test ourselves against or try to make our own. Thank you.
Well, to echo Tom, a huge thanks to Pauline and to Aisha, to everyone at Yale involved in the planning of this event. It's a real delight and a privilege and a pleasure to be here to participate in this lecture. And thank you to Tom for being willing to to be part of this experimental format. We didn't know one another before this. So this has been, I'm not sure if that was clear from the introductions. This has been an ingenious act of intellectual matchmaking on the part of Pauline and Aisha, and it's been a real pleasure to begin conversations with Tom that I hope will go on long after this lecture. What do the following 4 fictional characters have in common? First, Leopold Bloom, the hapless and peripatetic hero of James Joyce's Ulysses. Second, Jeeves, the unflappable butler in P.G. Wodehouse's Jeeves and Wooster series. Third, Otavio, the wayward husband in the Brazilian novelist Clarice Lispector's first stream of consciousness masterpiece, Near to the Wild Heart. And fourth and finally, Moses Herzog, the hero in Perpetual Crisis of Saul Bellows Herzog. Now, from the title of this event and from Pauline's summary of my current preoccupations, you might have guessed the answer. All 4, despite their obvious differences, share an admiration for the 17th century Dutch philosopher Benedict or Baruch Spinoza. So Thoughts from Spinoza, brackets, maroon leather, is on Leopold and Molly Bloom's bookshelves. And in her closing inner monologue, Molly recalls, politely enduring Leopold mansplaining some of these thoughts to her. Him, the other side of me, talking about Spinoza and his soul that's dead, I suppose, millions of years ago. I smiled the best I could. Jeeves, offered a thank you gift by his employer at the start of the novel Joy in the Morning, asks for the, quote, new and authoritatively annotated edition of the works of the philosopher Spinoza. Lispector's Otavio, musing on the nature of genius, exclaims, I must see if I can apply this discovery in relation to Spinoza. What do you propose to do now your wife has taken a lover? Bellows Herzog asks himself rhetorically. Quote, pull Spinoza from the shelf and look into what he says about adultery? The fact that Spinoza and his work have been of great interest to novelists and writers is probably not news to many of you in this room, although attention to this fact has tended to focus either on authors who fictionalized Spinoza's life or on great figures who had long and sustained encounters with his work, such as Goethe or George Eliot, who translated the whole Ethics into English, though it was never published in her lifetime. In my current work, I've become particularly preoccupied with though not with these protracted encounters, but with the kind of reference to or mention of Spinoza that I've listed above. These mentions are fleeting, oblique, often with a serio-comic tone that makes their significance difficult to gauge. And so to turn to the key word in our lecture title, our shared lecture title, that Tom ended his remarks by discussing, it seems more obvious that a figure like Eliot, with her translation of Spinoza or her studying of her novel Daniel Deronda with references to him, it seems obvious that Eliot in some sense took Spinoza as a model for ethical life. But it's really less clear what the writers I've just been listing are doing. Why should fleeting and opaque Spinozan references of this sort concern us? So depending on the particular critical interests and orientations that you bring into the room, Spinoza's name might be an unlikely one to encounter in a discussion of literary and theoretical models, or it might be an all too predictable one. In some circles, it seems impossible to move without bumping into Spinoza. A notable example here would be affect theory. So to give you one instance of this, Michael Hart, in his foreword to the influential volume, The Affective Turn, writes of, quote, Baruch Spinoza, the philosopher who has advanced furthest the theory of the affects, and whose thought is the source, either directly or indirectly, of most of the contemporary work in the field. And it's actually, when you think about it, a really striking instance of an early modern metaphysician shaping an entire field of contemporary thought in such a direct and openly acknowledged way. But I would argue, as a sort of general characteristic of this kind of work, that while Spinoza's influence has indeed been broad, as Hart suggests, it's also had a tendency to be somewhat shallow and unidimensional in its breadth. So often Spinoza's accounts of the affects in this context will appear in a doubly mediated way. First of all, mediated by Gilles Deleuze, the most influential theoretical expositor of Spinoza, whose account lies behind a lot of his influence on affect theory, and then by figures, most notably Brian Masumi, who have helped introduce Spinoza into the Anglo-American forms of affect theory. But I also think this feeling I have, that again, I wonder if some of you share, that Spinoza is sort of everywhere and nowhere in contemporary thought, everywhere present but not in the kind of texture of his thinking, is partly because he has been particularly influential in affect theory, but he has had an equally important and no less elusive role in a whole array of quite different theoretical traditions. So, for example, Louis Althusser claimed that he and his followers were not structuralists, but heretical Spinozists, and he called Spinozism one of the greatest lessons in heresy that the world has ever seen. I won't be focusing on this today, but there is a lot to say about these distinct and also intertwined theoretical areas and their various legacies. But what interests me today, the kind of wider tendency, I guess, that I want to pull out of this material, the shared tendency is, as I've already suggested, a kind of losing of sight of the extent to which Spinoza has historically served not just as a reservoir of theoretical and critical ideas to be extracted, but in more than one sense, to go back to this key term, as a model. His status as a model of ethical thought cannot be separated from his status as a model of ethical life. His earliest biographers were troubled by the fact that although, as they saw it, Spinoza professed atheism, he nonetheless, and this was very challenging to early modern views of what atheism, the kind of terrible malfeasance and moral turpitude that atheism would lead to, even that those who loathed his thinking had to admit that Spinoza lived a blameless life of cerebral serenity. He has gone on, as Althusser's rather wonderful characterization hints, to become a model of sorts for different versions of secular modern subjectivity, particularly in his rejection of the Judaism in which he was raised, without having then embraced an alternative faith. So he's often described as the first modern subject, partly for these reasons. But if Spinoza presents in some ways a model body of thought and a model life, to go back to the distinction that Tom's introduced, again, I see these principally as operating as what we might think of as static models, in the various senses that the Oxford English Dictionary helps us to understand the word model. So it principally means to us something like a structured, graspable whole on which subsequent actions might be modelled, might be patterned, an archetype which can in turn become a pattern. But it's very interesting to scrutinise a little the etymology of the term model. In doing so, we're guided towards a very different set of connotations, which are much less to do with this graspable, holistic structure. The English term derives likely via French and Italian from the Latin word modulus, which means a small measure, specifically in an aqueduct, where it is a pipe for controlling the flow of water, and then began to be used by extension from this primary sense in poetics, where it can refer to rhythmical measure, melody, meter, or poetic time. So a model might not be just the static structure on which acts can be patterned, but the controlled, rhythmically modulated dynamism that constitutes and sustains that whole. And what I'd like to suggest about Spinoza's thought today is that despite the widespread theoretical incorporation of it to which I've alluded, it's been limited in its full impact because he's been treated principally as a static rather than as a dynamic model, which is to say that the contents of his thoughts, say his account of the affects in the case of affect theory, has been separated from what we might think of on the basis of my etymological foray as something like the pipework of his thinking, its panoply of rhythmical jerks and flows. And I want to pause here to make a wider point, which I think also speaks to Tom's interest, which is that I'm particularly interested in Spinoza's fate or presence in this regard, but I do think it can be used to illuminate a wider point regarding our moment of what I often think of as post-theoretical confusion and exhaustion. Existing amidst a wide array of theories that we cannot straightforwardly embrace or even seek to master all of. It's tempting, and I touched on this yesterday in my conversation with Jonathan Kramnik, for those of you who were there. It's tempting to go down the route influentially opened up by Rita Felsky of lumping these theoretical models together as forms of critique and seeking to move past the limiting tone, mood, or manner of critical theory as a whole in search of something more productive. I understand why this is a very tempting option at the current moment, but I do think it's something that we should resist. And rather than moving away or past critical theory in this way, I see this as a really opportune moment, and I think our papers speak to this in different and complementary ways. This feels like a really opportune moment for revisiting some of the people who we think of as the key practitioners of literary theory, neither as prophetic saviours of critical study, nor as demonic threats to it, but precisely as writers. That's to say, as dynamic rather than as static models. So rather than sort of processing these figures, whether it's Nancy, Derrida, Kristeva, Adorno, and so on, in summary form, rather than seeing what we can take from them as their central tenets, necessary and helpful time saver though this can be, this risks eclipsing them as writers who might be scrutinised also for their non-paraphrasable practice. But my way to get at this feature of Spinoza's thought, as I've already said, is to pursue him not primarily in relation to the way he's been read by later theorists, but via the point at which I began, the fleeting and curious encounters with him that we often find in novels and poems. Because I suspect, or one of my working hypotheses, is that these literary writers are often the ones who are best attuned to the curious nature of Spinoza's writing and to his status as a dynamic rather than a static model. So I'm suggesting that the way in which he flashes briefly into view in their works reflects something of the way his philosophy proceeds as a stop-start waterpipe of bafflement and insight. And interestingly, or perhaps ironically, given that he has contributed, as I said, so decisively to this tendency to allude to Spinoza in general terms rather than engage with his dynamic thinking, the best account of this that I find is given by Deleuze, who writes in an essay on Spinoza. He is a philosopher who commands an extraordinary conceptual apparatus, one that is highly developed, systematic, and scholarly. And yet he is the quintessential object of an immediate, unprepared encounter, such that a non-philosopher, or even someone without any formal education, can receive a sudden illumination from him, a flash. Then it is as if one discovers that one is a Spinozist. One arrives in the middle of Spinoza. One is sucked up, drawn into the system or the composition. And this is a wonderfully resonant account. I think it well describes what I'm finding in these writers who are not systematic thinkers of Spinoza, but experience and allow us to experience these flashes. But what I'd like to do that Deleuze doesn't do is bring it back to bear on the specific forms and modulations of Spinoza's own thought. I can only do this briefly today, but I want to kind of gesture towards this. So I'm sure many of you will have at least a passing familiarity with some of these details. So the most challenging and complicating factor in understanding Spinoza's ethics is his adoption of it, as he proclaims here in his subtitle, of a geometrical method. A bold move, indeed, for understanding the intricate workings of reality and of human psychology. And he explains this choice as the deliberately challenging implementation of a classical model, that of Euclid's Elements. And he proclaims in this work, I will consider human actions and appetites exactly as if I were studying lines, planes, or bodies. And the figurative nature of this statement, I won't say much about this, but it's worth paying attention to the axis, right? It is being cast as a metaphor of some kind. This is, as I say, a much discussed choice. Something people have historicized it extensively, thought about it in relation to 17th century geometrical discourses. Many helpful commentaries have been produced to assist the modern reader in seeing past the peculiarities and difficulties of this abstruse method to the ethical content of Spinoza's thought. But what I want to close these remarks today by suggesting is that we shouldn't be too quick to assume the all-importance or total explanatory power of the Euclidean model and the need for intellectual decoding that its difficulty seems to impose upon us. The model that is Euclid's Elements, I would suggest, is supplemented and complicated by another classical precedent of a somewhat more dynamic and complicating kind. The historian of philosophy Susan James has noted the, quote, profound influence that she points out that ancient Stoicism had on Spinoza, arguing, quote, that much of the theory laid out in the Ethics is Stoic in inspiration. And I want to build on this insight by James by accentuating one of the key features of certain prominent strands within Stoic thought, associated especially with the figure of Marcus Aurelius. And this is the strategy, again, I'm sure familiar to some of you, of redescribing a disablingly or distractingly familiar experience as strange and alien, of decomposing it into its constituent parts, or rethinking the whole of which it is a part, in order to enable a new stance to be taken towards it. This is a famous example from the Meditations. Surely it is an excellent plan, Marcus writes, when you are seated before delicacies and choice foods to impress upon your imagination. This is terrible before a reception, I realise, I apologise. To impress upon your imagination that it is the dead body of a fish, that the dead body of a bird or pig. Surely these are excellent imaginations going to the heart of actual facts and penetrating them so as to see the kind of things they really are. This strategy, which is extensively deployed, though not explicitly theorized by Stoic writers, has been called reductive description by Foucault and, quote, the alienation strategy by Julia Annas. And I believe that we should consider Spinoza's transposition of human actions and appetites into the register of lines, planes, and bodies, not just as a geometrical method, but as a similar kind of estranging strategy in the Stoic tradition. I thought I might talk a bit more about some of the details of it. I'll just put this up there for you to browse if you haven't read it before, just to remind you what a deeply odd reading experience this is. Of course, we have to seek to understand and unpack the kind of claims that he's making, but I don't think we should be too quick to move in our, perhaps, struggle with that difficulty past the stylistic strangeness of the ethics, the rhetorical brilliance of its anti-rhetoric. If we do not feel the way in which Spinoza's language and our categories and experiences to which he refers are being wrenched and made to shudder as they are redescribed, if we treat him only as a static model of thought and not as a dynamic model of writing and thinking, then we miss much of the power and significance of his text. And this is a power, to return to where I began, to which I think literary writers have been particularly finely attuned in crafting their Spinozan flashes of thought. It's no accident, I think, that there's such a tantalizing affinity between the terms I just quoted to you, reductive redescription or alienation strategies, the way modern scholars have described these Stoic tendencies, and the effects of alienation and estrangement theorized extensively in the 20th century, most famously by Shklovsky and Brecht, but widely practiced in an array of ways by all kinds of modernist writers. So perhaps this shared interest in estrangement is one of the reasons, or one of the ways we might seek to understand the particular affinity for Spinoza, shared not only by Joyce, who also wove Spinozan allusions into Finnegan's Wake that are very interesting, and Lispector, but also writers such as Borges and Beckett and other high modernist greats. These writers, I think, were better attuned, as we might seek to attune ourselves, to the dynamism of Spinoza as a model, interested not just in his life or in the fine grain of his ethical thinking, but in his tactically estranging strategies as a writer. And so Spinoza remains a potent model for contemporary critical theory, or for the dynamic practices of writing and thinking that we want to undertake in the ongoing aftermath of theory. But if this means continuing to read him with, alongside, and against Deleuze or Althusser, it also, perhaps more surprisingly, means reading over the shoulder of Joyce and Lispector, of Herzog and Jeeves. Thank you very much. I'm just going to grab a water. Do you want one? No, I'm just going to grab one from over here. Thanks.
So I'm going to invite Joe and Tom to ask each other some questions, but perhaps as Joe's getting some water, I think it might be helpful if I take 1 minute to just pull out what might be obvious but is hard to digest into dense talks about seemingly unrelated subjects. And so I want to start by saying the impetus for this conversation was that word model. And models and muses of the title. And as will be clear from both their talks, the question of how we think about models, and specifically the relationship between so-called theory with a capital T and the texts, particularly in the context of the classics, is liable to fall into that complicatedly odd hierarchical imposition of, well, here's the theoretical pattern, I'm going to find a bunch of texts to fit the model, and then I'm going to explicate them, and done. And I think what both Joe and Tom are inviting us to do, and what I will say we discussed as we were thinking about this conversation, was precisely how do we move away from that well-established model that we all profess to dislike and then perform in our own work all too often, to rethink what is the kind of model work that theory can offer in our encounter with texts, right? And so just to kind of very quickly, Tom, I love the way in which you unpacked for us the way in which reading through Nancy, we see the kind of amazing weirdness, honestly, of Virgil's fourth eclogue, and the style of writing of Nancy's particularly kind of prophetic, abstruse opening up helps us see that same mode of thinking in Virgil in a way that's easy to gloss over if we don't linger, as you did so beautifully, on that work. And similarly, Joe, I love the way in which we read over the shoulder of these writers to see what on earth are they seeing in Spinoza, to see what Spinoza himself might have been seeing in the Stoics and in these kinds of classical texts, right? So thinking, one might say, theory and reception very differently if we pose them as a kind of model work. So just having kind of brought those threads together, I want to take a moment to kind of let you both speak to each other or ask each other questions. I know you've been in conversation about this. In thinking about, one should acknowledge, quite different projects, but which I think are conceptually resonant in so many ways that I think for us in the room maybe help us think about how profitable it is to bring seemingly different objects and texts into illuminating juxtaposition, both within the talks you gave, but also between your two talks. So I'm going to stop talking and let you talk for a bit and then jump in with my many questions.
Sure. Well, that's a super helpful
Shall I
summary.
go first with a question, seeing as you're...
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm just going to ask you to step closer
Are we
because
close
we
enough?
do have a recording.
Okay.
I think that's
Is that
good.
okay?
Yes?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Should we jump back to the quotation
Sure,
from
yeah.
Deleuze?
Yeah, by all means.
Is it?
There we go. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I just picking up Aisha's point about the usefulness of models. I mean, here we have a kind of in miniature model for reading Spinoza philosophically being articulated by Deleuze, and you illustrated its usefulness really wonderfully. I just wonder whether you could say a little bit more about something which I found very striking about this, which is the language of kind of illumination, the flash, and specifically the suddenness of illumination. So I wonder how you think that conceptualization of the reading encounter as something which bestows this perhaps kind of transparent kind of understanding, or certainly a kind of understanding that seems to strike very immediately. I wonder how you think that relates to the strategies of kind of reading Spinoza as a kind of practice of thinking. Whether you think there's a continuity or discontinuity there, or...
It's a great question, and I guess an important caveat perhaps to give to my paper is that what I'm offering is not a manifesto for thinking in flashes. I'm very interested in the flashes of connection, but I also think that that's not we need to find a way and a sort of space for thinking about these kinds of encounter that don't fit into the kind of high road of the reception history of a figure, which would maybe think more about Elias and so on. But precisely what interests me, actually, is the kind of range and variety of those encounters, and the fact that Spinoza provoked, lifelong forms of fascination that really were about temporally extended, repeated, transformative reading, but also about these things that are much more feel like kind of transformative happenstance of a certain kind. And what I'm interested in is whether that range of ways of reading might inform the ways that we in turn read. So I'm doing a slightly uncouth and cheaty thing, but there's another quotation from Deleuze that nearly made it into the paper, and I had to cut it for time, but I'm just going to read it very quickly because it kind of wonderfully complements this one. So he also says in his book on Spinoza, his shorter book, Practical Philosophy, he says, "The Ethics is a book written twice simultaneously. Once in the continuous stream of definitions, propositions, demonstrations, which develop the great speculative themes with all the rigours of the mind. Another time in the broken chain of scholia, a discontinuous volcanic line, a second version underneath the first." And so the idea is that there's maybe volcanic rumbling and flashing, right? There's sort of ways of that sounds much more like something that, in order to appreciate that, requires temporal extension, modulation, change. That's much more like the kind of water pipe of my sort of aqueduct model of things being, the kind of flow being sped up and slowed down. So ultimately what I want is precisely the full range of those things to be thought about. But what I think he gives us rather beautifully with this is that what I think he wants from this is the estrangement that I think Spinoza also wants. The flash is the thing that startles us, that kind of makes us blink, and we have to reconfigure our vision after the flash of lightning. So it's to make more room for that, but I think it's necessary but not sufficient as a way of thinking. And my next set of questions for this project that are genuine questions that I want to spend next year trying to work out, but I'm very open to discussion of this, is what's the form of my writing about this going to be that tries to be attentive to that range of kinds of encounter? And the challenge of that is finding a publisher who wants to listen to that problem, right? Because because chapters don't work for this, right? Some of our forms are not equal in their length and intensity of analysis. And I don't want to necessarily write something Spinozan, but I want to write something that is somehow in its way of putting these ideas into practice, sort of responsive to that. Yeah. And I might pivot on that to my question to you, actually, because I wanted to pick up something you said about, which I thought was a really interesting link between our papers, and you did touch on this, but so it's really one of those kind of could you just say more questions. But it's when you talked about the dynamism of Nancy's writing and his marriage of form and argument. So I felt like you were pointing in a sort of similar direction. I was struck that there are probably two ways in which post-structuralism died. Right, one is that it reduced to summaries of the kind of thing post-structuralism did, and the other thing it became was a pastiche of itself. And there were people who tried to write like Derrida, like Nancy, and it became very sort of elephantine in its wit, in the attempts to emulate those. So a direct emulation didn't seem to work. And so I'm wondering if you could say more about what you get from Nancy as a writer that doesn't seem to produce in you a sort of mimetic desire to think like Nancy in a way that was one of the ways that the influence of this work played itself out, right? But you're not at that kind of distance of this is the kind of thing Nancy does, but neither are you inhabiting him in some sort of shameless way. So I'm just wondering if you could say a bit more both about his dynamism as a writer and also about what you what does that give you as a critical thinker of that dynamism?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways in which that dynamism manifests itself, and obviously I wasn't able to talk about this at all today, is in these really quite kind of startling shifts that Nancy stages of both register and thinking, from this kind of when he's trying to think about what pagan antiquity was, what this kind of regime of presence where everything is kind of manifest in its plenitude simultaneously to the inhabitants of the land. These shifts he stages between this very kind of portentous, typically French post-structuralist, we might say, language of sort of big claims, to this sort of very detailed attention to what living in this world might have been like. So there's one passage, for instance, where he makes this big claim about the plenitude of presence in this world. One can encounter the gods anywhere. And then he unpacks at quite some length across a few sentences what this might look like. You could encounter the god when you go into the stable, along the roadside. You can encounter a god in a barn owl or a slow worm. And so there's this kind of lingering on the details of this world that feels to me stylistically very strange. This sort of shift from this very kind of quotidian, kind of descriptive language, this attempt to kind of inhabit or at least reach out to a world through literary style, versus these big kind of conceptual claims. So I think that kind of jarring estrangement is one thing that I find useful about his writing. And very stimulating. It to me suggests a way of reading, which I think is helpful for ancient poetry. But I think it also sits fascinatingly in his intellectual history, in the kind of that he constructs, which in some ways is very conventional. Right? I mean, he's putting together a system that has very, very recognizable and obvious intellectual antecedents. Heidegger's History of Being is kind of writ large through Nancy, and this essay repeats many tropes of kind of romantic and kind of post-Kantian thinking about the loss of antiquity and so forth. So in many ways, Nancy is very conventional. But on the other hand, I think there's an attempt which is manifest in those moments of dynamism to kind of think past that conventionality almost, and to kind of not precisely re-experience antiquity in its plenitude, but rather experience through literary form the particular kind of distances that we have to inhabit in relation to antiquity. So that kind of thing, I think, is what I find most interesting about his writing.
That's really
I'm standing up because I think the obvious point that I'm sure we all want to hear you talk about is It sounds like both of you are reorienting theory, signaled here by Norcy on the one hand, Deleuze, Spinoza on the other, and with the sort of specter of Brian Massumi and affect theory, away from a kind of content-oriented, we must take the ideas and put them back into literature, or see literature in some kind of, as a object through the lens of the ideas, but instead to say, let's go back and think about theory, or these writers of theory, as writers, as literary figures whose literary work is the conceptual unpacking of familiar modes of seeing. Is that a fair characterization of the ways in which you're both using or getting through theory towards various kinds of more familiarly literary objects?
Yeah, I think that describes accurately what I'm trying to do with Nancy. I mean, there's also a slightly more kind of critical element, I suppose, in the way I'm approaching Nancy, which is to sort of use his particular intellectual history of landscape as a way of being responsive in ancient texts to things that I think he would deny to ancient texts. So that's a slight...
But this is an interesting point too with Joe's project as well, which is there's the intellectual historical genealogy that gets us at Nancy's reading of where the classical past fits into our relationship to the natural world. Or in your case, thinking about the genealogy of Spinoza as this pivotal figure from a particular, moving away from Cartesianism, thinking towards other possibilities of ethical being, right, and sort of feeling of the subject. And to sort of disrupt those intellectual genealogies by sort of reading through these contemporary thinkers and writers back to their objects of study, right?
Yes.
So like there's a kind of double cross-cutting, the kind of opening up of the actual theoretical writing,
Yes.
but then using that to query the intellectual genealogies that have been crafted by them and around them.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think what I like about this as a way of moving, what I hope might resonate with people is that I do think this is an intellectually rich and responsible way to go about how we approach these figures. But I think it's a kind of more practical, manageable way, right? Like we're trained to think about people as readers and writers, and we're at this point now where there is such a sort of tidal wave of material to try and assimilate. And if you can allow yourself, I mean, in many ways, the way you're very helpfully framing it, the kind of questions we would then be asking of a thinker with whom we're wrestling, what's the quality of voice here? What's the kind of position from which this thinking is happening? Those are questions of which that we might ask of a poem, right? And so we're on interesting, not in a bad way, familiar territory. Not because we sort of know exactly what we have to do, but we know how to get started with asking those questions. And so thinking about theories. Not just absolutely via. We do need to think about their intellectual genealogies, their institutional situatedness, all those crucial questions. But there might be something useful about thinking of them as an array of alienation effects, which would function quite differently from one another. There are many ways to do alienation, right? But if you read, but that would be a really interesting way to try and get a handle on what someone like Adorno is up to, right? And the way in which ordinary language is being kind of scrutinized as a category and disrupted in certain ways and from within and so on. So I like that for its richness of possibility, but also for its practicality, I think.
Yeah, and on the point of practicality, I mean, I would also emphasise the "and us" in the title of that,
Yes.
Because obviously, one of the things that I want to do by reading Virgil through Nancy and vice versa is, to think about how Virgil, might disclose himself to us in a very kind of specific historical moment, but also in the kind of intellectual history that Nancy creates, which is not that of some of the kind of canonical streams of Virgilian kind of reception and thought. So, thinking about the kind of the individual encounter with these texts, of which, of course, reading closely for kind of style and style as thinking is an obvious manifestation, is I think also really important to do as well.
I'm going to permit myself one more question and give you time to think about your questions. This is just talking fast. But I think a really important question that this talk and this format raises for us in classics and comparative literature is the most common way in which Parry lectures in classics and comparative literature proceed is by reception study, right? We start in the early modern period and we look at classical sources or models, or we start in the present and we find the complex networks of intertextual genealogy. And that's a method that we're all familiar with in this room. And both of you broke that method, even though you bumped up against that word reception in your remarks and your conversation with each other. And I wonder if, as a useful starting point for our larger conversation, you can each maybe unpack what you see as being the relationship between that thing called reception that we all do in different ways, or intertextuality, and the kind of conceptual theoretical unpacking that you both did in your talks.
It's a very good question.
That was not meant to stop the conversation.
I guess the thing I would say is that my sort of bafflement, my kind of happy bafflement in the face of those opening allusions that I listed is very genuine. Right? I'm not performing that bafflement for rhetorical purposes. I really don't know what to make of these moments. And the P.G. Wodehouse one, which is the most ludicrous, is particularly fun because it mostly just consists of puns on Spinoza's name. So it's quite possible that the reason he chose Spinoza is, Bertie was to go to the bookshop and says, I want to buy the latest work of Spinoza, and the bookseller's book, you can't mean that. So, could you mean the spinning wheel, sir? No, Spinoza. And so it could just be wordplay, right? It could just be that the name appealed to him. And so what interests me is the spectrum of possibility from insignificance to deep significance is very broad. And that makes the question, and that makes this, for me, a particularly intriguing way, in a sense, to pose the question that you're posing, right? I mean, the question is, one of the questions I want to pose is, does this count as a reception history? People have written reception histories of Spinoza in different contexts. So there's the Yale 2-volume thing that some of you will know, which has a kind of first volume on Spinoza, and then the second volume goes, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Freud, Marx is early, but it's just a kind of, it's the high road of a certain kind of broadly German philosophical tradition. So, and there are versions that you can do of that. There's the Jonathan Israel version that takes him through the Enlightenment, right? So he's such a kind of Rorschach test. So many people have found so much in him that you can tell then these neat stories which do fit to varying degrees more of a kind of reception model as maybe we think of it. But what interests me about this is precisely that it's not clear that it works in that way, and therefore becomes potentially an opportunity to think differently about. It is important to me that this it is also about looking at Spinoza, as you said, over these people's shoulders. It only matters if it changes the way we read him. But it's also a way of thinking differently about how we gather together the readers of someone that doesn't fall into those linear genealogies.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm interested in a way of thinking about relations between texts that goes beyond the kind of canonical moves that reception criticism has tended to structure itself around. I mean, somewhat flippantly, one might say that, in this Nancy essay, meaning isn't created at the point of reception for various reasons. I mean, one being, of course, that, Nancy doesn't engage with the eclogues specifically. He has a sort of passing reference to the Georgics, on the basis of which he kind of elaborates a whole understanding of how you should read the Georgics, but he doesn't engage with eclogue force. So, I mean, on a very kind of straightforward sort of reception approach, one might say, well, there isn't really any eclogues in this essay, therefore it's not a particularly useful place to go for it. And in a sense, I think that's true, because as I was saying, there are lots of ways in which this essay just doesn't really work for a reading of the eclogues, or it does work, but in just very obvious kind of canonical ways. Virgil is a land filled with gods and so forth.
But it worked so beautifully in what you did,
well,
right?
But right. I mean, but I think the points at which it's really interesting are those which I think a more kind of canonical way of doing reception perhaps wouldn't quite be
capture.
Yeah, wouldn't quite be sort of attended to. So a kind of pluralization of relation, I think, is probably what I'm interested in.
It's a lovely phrase. So on that note of the pluralization of relation, I open it up plurally to all of you. Yes. Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So thank you so much. Really interesting. I'd love to ask about Spinoza's God. And so in particular, something that seems like in Marx, Spinoza's theory of God is a sort of transcendence, right? Not being personal, but seems quite different from the boy of Epoch 4. Maybe there's interesting connections there. But also I'm wondering about how Spinoza's views about God, and especially maybe sort of transcendence, relate to the sort of systematicity that Muses is talking about here in relation to these flashes, and how these flashes have to do with kind of grasping the whole system, where on one hand it might seem inaccessible, just like kind of Spinoza's God is in some ways inaccessible, although we're part of God, but in some ways the flashes do seem to connect us to a whole sort of system.
Right.
So that was a whole sort of cluster of ideas, but would love to hear either of both of you comment on that.
No, that's great, thank you. And obviously with time pressures today, I haven't been able to get into the kind of weeds of Spinoza's philosophy, so this is a bit of an invitation to do that, but we can't go too far down the rabbit hole, so I'll try to mix my metaphors. But you brought this out really nicely, right? The extraordinary thing about Spinoza's conception of God is, as you said, is simultaneously, in one sense, inaccessible, and in another sense, inescapable, right? So all that is ever experienced is God in some modal form, right? Under some attribute of extension, right? So some attribute, thought or extension, but what that does, I think, is, and this is what Spinozan, sort of philosophers who work on Spinoza are still obviously wrestling with, right? Is how to understand the relationship. That's one of the greatest controversies in the interpretation of Spinoza, right? Is how to understand the relationship between the specific modalities in which we experience things and the overarching conception of substance, of which those things are modalities. And so that does strike me as setting up a really sort of curious and deeply complex and fascinating relationship between the particularity of any given modal experience and some sense of the whole, which is there, which I do think speaks interestingly to this conception of the flash versus the system, right? So there is something there, I think, in the way that we navigate the ethics, in the question of its parts in relation to its whole. I don't think it's as straightforward as it's not trying to be mimetic of that experience more broadly, but I think it has something to do with it, right? Something about the way we navigate modality in Spinoza's view is, I think, in the reading experience. Yes, I'll stop there because otherwise it gets very. It was a great question. Thank you.
Other thoughts? Questions? Yes.
Yeah, just very quick also on Spinoza's point. I wonder if you could articulate what you take from the alienation that we're supposed to get. And I think also this also applies in the Virgil passage. But so I have this. I had this feeling when I read Spinoza for the first time, and I also have it when I read like David Lewis, like when I read some contemporary philosophy, and I feel utterly alienated from the world of everyday experience. But I don't take it that those people are writing those papers in order to alienate me such that I can come forward in the world that that's just what they think is the case. So I know we're not trying to get into Spinoza's mind, that's not the but what is it that we can, I just wanted to understand more what we can take away from that alienation.
Shall I dive with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to respond to that as well. But do you want to?
Well, why don't you start?
Well, I mean, I suppose what I find particularly interesting about the lines that I was looking at in regard to their production of an effect of some kind of alienation or estrangement is first and foremost that hasn't really been the way that they've been read traditionally, and also that then the kind of critical tools that have traditionally been brought to bear on Eclogue 4, very productively, needless to say, more recently kind of intertextually and metapoetically kind of inflected ways of treating the text, historically seeing it in terms of panegyric rhetoric and so forth, don't really allow one to be attentive to those potentially alienating features of the language, and the relation between form and phenomena that I was trying to get at. Then, I think Nancy is sort of helpful for that in the ways that I was suggesting. And then the sort of larger ethical kind of implications of that, which I obviously only had time to kind of gesture towards very briefly today. I think a couple of things might be said just to expand on what I said in the talk. First of all, I think it sort of those lines read in those ways, I think, emphasize the importance of various forms of distance and kind of non-appropriativeness in relation to like the world around us and things that we might, be tempted to kind of objectify and so forth. But also, I think it's sort of it enables us to take perhaps a slightly more kind of critical or kind of perhaps self-aware stance towards the modalities of reading that have kind of enabled us to construct Virgil in ways other than that. Right? So I think it's also a useful site for us to think about, what Virgil means for us today, and what it might mean for us to use a textual world premised on a very different understanding of the universe to address our own kind of contemporary situation. Right? So for me, I think estrangement is a kind of starting point for thinking about that kind of relation.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a great question, so thank you for this. I guess one thing I was going to say, so a book that's hovering in the background of my discussion of those issues, which might resonate with the classicists in the room, is Pierre Hadot's book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. I don't know how many of you have read that and how recently you've read it, but the last thing he quotes in the title essay, which is the last thing in the book for the interview with him, is the ending of Spinoza's Ethics. So he ends the book with the Ethics, with the famous line about things that are valuable being difficult, and it's one of my very favourite books, and I'm leaning heavily I quoted Foucault, but Foucault at that point is reading Hadot on the Stoics, right? The one place where I disagree with what Hadot is doing is that he says that when he inserts Spinoza into this tradition of stoical, where alienation is just one of the ways in which the doing of philosophy is actually the living out of philosophy. He says at one point, just before the end, he says, if you can look past the geometrical method of the ethics, you can see all the ways in which it fits this Stoic model perfectly. And my one difference with him is don't look past it. The method is what gets him into that tradition. It's his very different way of being in that tradition. Sorry, as I'm wandering past the microphone, I'm a wanderer when I lecture. Sorry. But I do see it in that tradition of, as he lays it out, of philosophy in a sense that is. I'm really interested in what you said about the way you read philosophy, or the way you might read contemporary philosophy, because that conception, what I love so much about that book, what's so challenging about it, is that he wants to give this kind of existential seriousness to philosophy in a way that's slightly embarrassing for us to even talk about, right? But I do think there's a way that the ethics only works if it is one of those books that wants you to be a different person at the end than you were at the beginning, right? Its ambitions really are that high, and so if you're not inside, so actually the stakes of that alienation are individual transformation. It is, rousing you from your dogmatic slumbers, to misquote Kant, but the actual experience of undergoing that is, yes, it's about understanding his system. Yes, it's about wrestling with his particular ways of redescribing. But actually, I think the outcome, as Hadot puts it in relation to the Stoics, is conversion. Right? It's actually about deep individual transformation. And I've occasionally found myself when people have asked me why I'm interested in Spinoza, and I start giving the kind of versions, he's very interesting for rethinking this, and da-da-da. But one of the reasons is I think he might be right about some things, and have some things to say about our ethical life, and actually give us something of that experience in the reading of him. So that's actually what the alienation for me is about. It's giving you the beginnings of a distance from your unthinking norms that might open up a new possibility of living. That's a pretty that's a lofty answer, but I really believe that. I really think that his ambitions are that high.
Pauline.
I can't possibly ask a question after this. You actually answered my question, which was about the ethical stakes of the kind of literary criticism and theorizing that you're doing. But maybe I can ask the flip question, which is, if you see the position of the critic as so ethically invested and so self-sustaining as it is, what kind of form of writing criticism can you adopt that does justice to the stakes?
Yeah. That's a good question.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
I have to repeat the question for the recording, which I fell down on doing earlier. So I'm just going to very quickly repeat what Pauline said into this mic. So apologies for this slightly weird lag. But just to say, what form of writing should a critic take if the stakes for criticism are this kind of intense ethical performance of being? Go ahead.
And follow up, if you can.
Yes.
So, and how do we avoid the infinite recession into discourse? How do we read this kind of criticism that is itself a literary reading that sees the stakes, the ethical stakes of theory as it reads further text? I mean, how do we get out of here?
This is a very hard thing to repeat, but I will say, how do we not? I feel like we're performing this here, Pauline.
This is a great skit. I'm enjoying this. This is fun.
The infinite recursion of repeating discourse, where we read and repeat other people's questions.
Right.
Exactly. All right.
I mean, it's a very difficult question without one answer, obviously. I mean, I think if I had time, I would talk about this for a long time and say multiple things, but I think I'll constrain myself to saying that, I think one strand of this that's important is, trying to be as attentive as one can be to the as full a range of as possible as one can sort of encompass of what one thinks the text is doing, and try to sort of reflect that in as full a way as possible. Now, inevitably, that project, falls short of even what one as an individual critic is trying to do, let alone what other readers might want you to do. But I think that sort of openness to as full a possible range of what one thinks a given text is doing is one important move. Then also obviously kind of acknowledging the sort of inevitable limitations of what one's doing, but then hopefully doing that in a sort of way that's productive for other people to use as a starting point for their own journeys into the material. So those would be a couple of basic kind of orientations.
Yeah, I think that sounds right to me, and I would probably say something similar. I mean, it's as I said, I don't think either of us are moving towards a kind of direct replication of the thinking that we're interested in our own critical thinking. But I do think that there's a provocation here to make the modes of our critical thinking more internally various, and to set up a kind of internal dynamism to criticism. Maybe, and this speaks. I was having a conversation about this with some of the students yesterday, right, about the way, in different ways in my recent writing, which hasn't been about Spinoza, I've become more interested in doing this, and kind of partly by bringing myself into it in the first person, which is for me less about wanting to do something personal and more about allowing myself a way to manage those movements of thought. So what I'm imagining, I think, for Spinoza, this again, I am trying to work this out, but I don't want to write like him. But that point, the thing I read out from Deleuze, which thinks about the kind of two ethics and the kind of drive towards certainty, and then the temptation, and then the tendency to kind of undercut and unsettle, the kind of earthly, the volcanic undoing of those things. Some kind of movement there in the way that I want to write about him that might, for example, zoom in on some of these flashes, but then also consider the fact that actually they're deeply inscrutable, and so partly just a movement between forms of conviction and argument and forms of uncertainty and undoing of argument that we sometimes tend to leave out of our writing in the interest of making it authoritative. So a kind of willingness to self-problematize in a way that hopefully doesn't. It's a fine balance, right? Because there's a way of doing that could be very irritating for a reader, and so the kind of writerly challenge is how to make that happen. But one thing I've realised in working on this project, I've tended in my work to people sometimes say to me, "Oh, you work on really different things in your different projects," but it doesn't feel that way to me. Partly because I've realised through doing this that a lot of the writers I'm interested in, and Spencer, on whom Aisha and I have worked together, is the other case of this. I'm drawn towards writers who are simultaneously systematizers and self-complicators. So a deep desire for a final perfect, which is not ironized, that is a serious desire for an all-encompassing certain final system, combined with a deep and ineliminable tendency to self-sabotage and to put every possible obstacle in the way of that systematic ambition. And something about that interplay is what speaks to me in these writers, and that I would like in some sense to inform. I think there's something in there for the way that we do criticism, because it doesn't mean relinquishing the search for conviction, the search for certainty, but it becomes part of this more complicated dynamic that then creates, again, an interesting practical question. What does the writing look like that does justice to that interplay?
We're almost at 6:30, but maybe one more question if anyone has one, or we can have a glass of wine to digest conversion, alienation, and models and keep talking. All right, well, please, oh yes, go for it, Daniel.
I have a quick question about the normative turn that I think some of your arguments are making, just to elaborate on Professor Levin's question of the ethics, where, like I saw within both of your talks, this language of opening up possibilities, but also turning away from certain possibilities. So in your talk against ideas of genealogy, right, or some of maybe like the more sedimented ways that intellectual history is concisely summarized and then becomes even more sedimented, something that's static. Or you were talking in your focus on like the small passing references, as opposed to like the over biographical in the vein of like how Eliot would just kind of like take Spinoza as a general figure. And I guess my question is basically like I feel like as like an undergraduate coming out of this emphasis on like close reading and like rigor and like testing the possibilities, when I encounter a passage like the one you pulled up in Muses, right? When I see a character like has a book on the bookshelf, right? Like my initial instinct is that like I can't like map all of this thinker's like possibilities onto like this character. Like I can't read all of Bloom's like diegetic ideas and dispositions as Spinozistic, or like be like, oh, Molly rejects this, right? Like, and it's like something I'm like tempted to do, obviously, like at the end of like Cyclops, like Bloom is called phenomenologist, so then I'm like, oh, it's everything Bloom says phenomenologist.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like, I guess like, what are the limitations, right, of interpretation? Where would you foreclose possibilities? Where would you say you couldn't go by seeing that character as a figure on the bookshelf?
Yeah.
I guess something you also alluded to in your situation of the spectrum between like, what is significant and insignificant. I guess how do we determine what is significant?
Yeah.
I have to repeat the question. Everybody. Sorry.
Yeah.
But I'm going to make it very brief. I'm just going to say, if you could just, it's a beautifully articulated question. I'm going to offer a reductive summary, which is, can you speak to the limits of possibility and interpretation in the kind of method that both of you have opened up?
It is a wonderful question, and yes, the question about, and it does really speak to, in different ways we are asking one of those central questions of all critical method, which is what to make of, what counts as a significant detail, right? Is one way or another the question we're always asking in any kind of critical, any critical claim is a claim to significance of a certain kind of detail. So in some sense, that is the kind of essence of it. I guess. What would I say? I would say that, to go back to I alluded briefly in my talk to the kind of Riedefelsky method walls. I don't know if you've encountered any of this material in your reading, but one of the ways that's often framed is as a kind of opposition between paranoid reading and other kinds of reparative or sort of non-paranoid forms that have a more more positive set of affects associated with them. And I think we should not give up on paranoid reading so quickly, because paranoia is really interesting, and we need it to make sense of certain kind of texts that actually massively want to induce it in us as an effective mode, because it doesn't end the question of interpretation. It makes it ramify endlessly in this way, right? So you need to be a paranoid reader of Ulysses, and to fully experience that novel. This is true of the Fairy Queen, this is true of any, this is why these encyclopedic, mad, self-undermining systems are so interesting to me, is you cannot know for sure that any given detail couldn't be the key to the whole thing, right? So you have to take that possibility really seriously, that each part of it means deeply and is saturated, and there's no kind of inadvertent. And then again, we have lots, you can think about this in Freudian terms, right? That like psychoanalysis again tells us there is no insignificant detail. The tiny slip is the thing that gives away the deep meaning of the whole. But it's really hard to read a 1,000-page novel in that way, right? When you're thinking about every detail. So the critical act could be thought about as a kind of experimentally selective paranoia, where you're going to zoom in on the moment and think, what if this were the key to the whole, right? It's still in a kind of subjunctive mode, that inquiry, right? What if it were, not this is. But that seems like a really valuable way of thinking about, it's like, it makes me think about landscape. What if I stand here and survey this landscape, right? That'll be another way of thinking about the detail. It's going to open up certain things. It might or might not tell you about the whole thing. So I think there's no alternative to doing that in a certain way, right? But I think again, what's potentially useful to me about framing it in that way is every act of reading, if you want it to, has a sort of metacritical dimension, where you're asking the question of the detail, but you're also asking, what does it mean to take this detail as the key one? What would that say about the way the novel works? What would that say about the way this act of reading works? I think you can make it self-reflexive, so you're not saying, yep, that's it, Ulysses is all about this moment, I've cracked it, I've found the key to all mythologies. But there's a way of both doing that in a way that I think is true to the novel and the way that it wants us to think, but also enables us to reflect on the kind of interpretation that we're bringing to bear upon it. But you just have to do it. You just have to try it. You have to find your details. And that's partly also your version of Ulysses, is the footprints you've left through it as you've chosen the moments that you're going to try out in that way experimentally. But you can't know in advance. The only way to do that is to try and interpret the novel in light of the things that you've lighted upon.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would give three answers to that question. I mean, each revolving very briefly, each revolving around kind of provisional ends to the process of interpretation, which I don't think really has an end. I think it's potentially interminable. One is in relation to what I was saying. One in relation to reading Virgil, two in relation to one's kind of experience of the world, and three in relation to the kind of crystallization in particular forms of writing that responses might have. And this comes back to the final one comes back to Pauline's question. So first of all, just to unpack this very briefly, I mean, I think one way in which one might take further the kinds of reading that I've been trying to do today is think about how they relate to the Virgilian corpus as one experiences it at large. So that might be one kind of dimension in which a kind of particular interpretative trajectory doesn't necessarily end, but kind of ramifies in a contained way, right? That this experience might change one's kind of predominant approach to certain other passages of Virgil. Then there's the kind of ethical consequence of a particular kind of interpretative stance as it manifests itself in your experience of the world. And I would pick up here on what Joe was saying earlier about the stakes of reading the ethics. I mean, I think that a serious reading of any work of poetry ought to be in some sense transformative for one's experience of the world. And one of the things one should do as a reader is to try to be attentive to the forms of reading that enable that kind of transformation, or at least reorientation, to occur. So one of the kind of ends of interpretation is I go into the garden and I see the garden differently because I've been reading Virgil, right? to put it rather kind of prosaically. And then the other, and this comes back to Pauline's point, as I said, is that individual kind of critical responses are both ends and new beginnings in the process of interpretation. And I think where I would sort of lay the emphasis in regard to what I've been trying to do this evening is on the explicitly kind of idiomatic nature of those interpretations as affordances for further thought, right? And idiomatic both in the sense of sort of attending to particular details of of the primary text, the Virgil, but then also to similar details in non-Steve, and then trying to convey those idioms for the sake of others in a way that is itself also idiomatic. So those would be my 3 mini answers to that question.
I've got 4 more answers now.
That was amazing. And can I just say this was one of the most stimulating and exciting conversations I've been in in a long time. So please join me in thanking Tom and Joe.